All right, 6 o'clock. We got a lot to talk about today. And I think these classes are probably going to pick up now, and probably there'll be a little bit more content that I think everyone's familiar with, some names that will become more familiar with. And by next week, we will actually be talking about the beginning of the country itself. But today, we're still in that 1770s, 1780s time period during the Revolution. What we're going to do today is I'm going to do an overview of the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, if you will. We're going to we'll start off by looking at the material advantages versus the disadvantages of the colonial Continental Army versus that of the British Army. We're going to look at the strategies, overall strategies of both sides. And then we're going to look at I've pulled out some of the key battles that I'll go through the battles and explain why these were significant. When you're doing military history, especially when you do it at the intro level, you usually look at the causality of battles. You always try to identify what the uh, what the I just muted everyone just to be on the safe side because I heard a little background. Um, all right, so from a military history standpoint, you usually try to look at the causality of certain battles as you go through a war, identifying usually what the turning point of the war is. That's something that historians have been doing for, gosh, going all the way back to ancient Roman historians. They always want to look at which one of those battles is the turning point of the war itself, and goes toward gets the momentum going towards the eventual victor. And if you look at really military history, I always say military history is the training wheels for most historians, at least most from a statistical standpoint. Most male historians really get into history through military history. Um, like myself, I'm a great example. I got into history because my father used to take me to Civil War battlefields when I was like 6 and 7 years old. So it was kind of, force fed to me to some extent. But then, when I got into my history classes, I was very good at them. I understood history. Um, but it wasn't until, but, even the history that you took in sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade, and then into high school, they really focused on a lot of the battles and they focused on. So military history was kind of always a part of the history experience for almost anyone who who took public school education or even private school education. So our military history is kind of baked into our overall story. And I think, when we talk about the type of historical approach that you look at, you're either looking at it from a top down standpoint or you're looking at it from a bottom up standpoint, perspective wise. Typically, your top down historians, those who have looked at it from a ivory tower elitist kind of perspective, understand that those people are describing the history of mankind through politics, military history, and who the victors are, through empires, through the lens of those who are powerful or prestigious or who have held power. Those are the stories that much of our history's lens is usually through. The other side of that is the bottom up viewpoint, where you're looking at ordinary people through time whose stories you may have in the form of diaries or personal anecdotes, oral histories, but those stories also kind of balance it out. But one thing's for sure, and certainly in the historiography of United States history, military history has always been it. So when we look at something like the Revolutionary War, some of these battles, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the name of the battles if you're not really sure who won that specific battle. And that's part of that is not only part of the way that we do history, but it's also the way that American Revolutionary War history is done. You have to understand that the Revolutionary War was very propagandized um, during the time and then certainly afterwards. That generation was very much celebrated this victory, this political victory, this military victory, this philosophical victory. Um, you know, this was a very celebrated time in American history. So a lot of what we know about this time has been popularized for us, whether it's popularized in novels or whether it's popularized in plays and musicals, as 1776 is, and more recently Hamilton. All of this is all of this material that we're going to look at today as part of the war is is part of this thread that you probably already have a pretty good understanding of. But what we want to do is dissect it a little bit, pull it back, and understand why these battles were significant and why it led to the outcome that it did regarding, the really the weaker force uh, winning the war and eventually achieving independence. All right, so that was a little verbose, but that was my intro. Let's go ahead and dive in, and hopefully we'll learn a few things that we didn't previously know. Now, the first half of this class will be on the war itself. Second half, after our break, we're going to look at what I'm going to call the revolution within. The revolution within is really more Eric Foner than me. Revolution within talks about this crucial period of time before we have the Constitution, when we're nation building while at war, or before we, under our first form of government, which was the Articles of Confederation. And the challenges, um, and a lot of these challenges would be addressed in the Constitution, but then these challenges would also continue to be addressed throughout the history of our country. So our early politics and the gaps in our democracy become pretty well defined by the end of the revolution. So we're going to look at that again. We're looking at that today as well. All right. Okay. Make sure everyone can see my slide, intro slide. And we should be on the slide that has the British era map and the join or die logo up in the corner. If you are not seeing that, somebody please say something in the chat. We're good to go. All right. Okay. So once again, the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, was a conflict between the American colonies and Great Britain, okay, sparked by growing colonial opposition to British policies. And we talked about what these were: opposition to taxation without representation, right? Stamp Act, the Tea Act. Um, these obviously were grievances. Um, Tensions escalated after the Intolerable Acts, which were, once again, here's the causality. The Intolerable Acts were a British response to the Boston Tea Party. Okay? After these escalating tensions, um, and remember, there had already been tension in the West over land policy. I should say land policies, not and policies, over land policies, and there were tenant wars. So in all of the colonies there was tension everywhere in the colonies, and I think that part is important to understand why the revolution really occurs. You have to have, for a revolution to occur, you have to have tension across all social classes, all geographies. I mean, if you take the Revolutionary War and use it, the American Revolutionary War, and use it as a model, the same type of tension and strife was evident before the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Cuban Revolution is a little different, but still. And so, as we study these things from a historical standpoint, you got to look at what conditions led to this revolution, um, and ultimately the war. Okay. All right. The strategies of the war. British strategy was simple: divide and conquer. Rely on loyalist support, which is about 30% of the colonies, um, mainly in your colonies like New York, um, in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were heavy hotbeds for loyalist support for the British Empire. Now, from the British Empire standpoint, they realized they had to control key cities like New York City and Philadelphia. They wanted to isolate New England. New England were the radicals, as they saw it. They were the radicals that they had no support there. So where they wanted to set up their bases of operation were in places where they did have some support, in some of the port cities where they still had friends they were doing business with. Okay. So, like I said, New York, Philadelphia, and certainly New York will be after the Boston debacle and the British abandoned Boston. They're going to regroup and come back, and they're going to set up base of operations in New York City. Um, and so that's where the first phase of the war is going to be. It's really going to be in New York City, as the the British are going to try and set up New York City as a stronghold for them and a base of operations where they can link up um, with the other part of their force, which is in Canada, um, and and basically by connecting Canada and New York City, you can completely isolate New England and put an end to this war. That was the strategy. Okay, um, and they had a superior army, so this really was just that. Now, from the American standpoint, the strategy, the Continental Army, which at this point is led by George Washington, he's appointed uh, commanding general of the Continental Army at the Second Continental Congress. He leaves from Philadelphia to take command of the Continental Army. At this point, they're in Boston, but they relocate knowing that New York's going to be the next target for the British. So, Continental Army under George Washington, his I guess strategy is going to develop into one of utilizing guerrilla tactics. Although I don't know if they were actually called guerrilla tactics back then. If you would have asked one of Washington's contemporaries about the type of tactics he was using, they would say he's using Native American tactics. Probably Native American tactics that he used in the French War. Um, Washington also used local knowledge to his advantage. Oh, I've got something for you. Someone was asking before about a good historical movie or TV show. There's a TV show called Turn, which came out right around COVID, right before COVID. I think it was like 4 seasons, and really, really good show, and relatively historically accurate. It is all about the Culper Ring during the Revolution, which is George Washington's spy ring in New York and Connecticut. It's really well done, really well acted. The guy that plays Washington in Turner is, I think, spectacular portrayal of Washington. Um, but that was one of Washington's and the Continental Army's benefits. It's home turf, you know, local knowledge. You set up their own local spy networks. They knew the terrain. Um, However, ultimately, the strategy from the American standpoint, we saw this last week during the Continental Congress, um, alliances, particularly with France. France, whose military and financial support we would eventually get, would be the turning point for the American Revolution. Okay. Um, Now, on a more micro level, the military strategy for the Americans emphasized basically survival, fighting small battles, retreating strategically, and leveraging the home field advantage so they could exhaust British resources over time. Now, this strategy, one that I think you could make an argument was developed on the fly, has become the model for similar rebellion, revolution style tactics, including the Viet Cong, who used our very tactics against us during the Vietnam War. That's basically how this war was fought from the. Okay. Um, I think it's important when we look at the colonies during the Revolution. Once again, something that is often misunderstood is that everyone in the colonies was behind the revolution, and that's not the case. I've seen varying degrees of support, but I think from a historical standpoint, we can go ahead and say between 33 and 40% of the colonies at various times would consider themselves patriots. So overwhelmingly, the majority of those who lived in the colonies did not support the patriot cause, okay, or were ambivalent to it. Um, that is one of the reasons why loyalists were so important to the British strategy, because they felt that the loyalists would provide that home support, whether it's financial support, whether it's quartering of troops, whatever it may be. The loyalists were an important part of this strategy. Um, yeah. um, as I was saying, the American strengths. I mean, first of all, once you have this is why one of the reasons why the Declaration of Independence is such an important document. Obviously, it's an important document in our history. But what it also is at the time, it's a declaration of what this war was all about. It was something George Washington desperately needed. One thing that we're going to see throughout this war is Washington did a masterful job with. I mean, I hate to say it this way, but really the dregs of society. I mean, you can read those first few years. The army that Washington had was far from a professional army. Um, and remember also, being that he's from Virginia, early on, um, George Washington did not want any men of color serving in his Continental Army. He will change that opinion later, but and that goes back to something I didn't really have a whole lot of time or opportunity to discuss this when we were talking about the legacy of Virginia slaveholding. But Virginia slaveholders are very interesting case study when you look at the Lee family and you look at the Washington family and the Carters, and look at the way they carried themselves. And there is something to that aura, that Virginia gentleman lifestyle. Is very patriarchal, and their relationship with their enslaved is very patriarchal. Washington's body man, Billy Lee, was very, very close to George Washington, very close relationship. But they're and Thomas Jefferson the same way. They just have these very interesting and hypocritical outlooks on the institution of slavery. Publicly, they never really, the Virginians never really celebrate the institution of slavery the way that your Carolinians will. But they always kind of hang on that peculiar institution side of it. Yes, it's something we're not proud of, but we need it in order to make the economy go well, kind of an attitude. Well, being a Virginian, there was a long standing going back into the 1600s. There were long standing feelings against arming African American men, and so George Washington did not want uh, enslaved or free men of color fighting in the army at first. So, I mean, long story short, the army itself was not a strength of the American force at this time, although George Washington certainly was. George Washington has done a lot of growing up since that mistake he made in the forest, the French and Indian War. And by the American Revolution, I mean, what he's able to do with the weak army that he had is pretty amazing, certainly in those first 2 years. So, all right. Weaknesses. The colonists are not a very well trained army. Um, it was really, really hard to get these guys to stay in with their enlistment. First of all, they they could only get a few months of enlistment. I think it was like 6 month enlistment instead of like years, and that's going to be really, really tough to keep a piece of unit if you've got guys who are leaving after 6 months. And of course the AWOL problem was unbelievable, especially after the first year of the war. So and Washington had no way to pay these guys too. Some in many cases Washington financed some aspects of the army out of his own pocket. So it was tough. The American war effort was pretty lean until the French jump in after Saratoga. Meanwhile, the British, I mean, they were an experienced professional army. They outnumbered the the Americans, well supplied, um, and they had a powerful navy, and they could buy soldiers. The Hessians, who were basically German mercenaries, were a big part of their advanced force. However, the weaknesses, all right, they're not fighting for a cause. It's kind of once again a good parallel is the Vietnam War. It's fighting without a heart. I mean, you're in someone else's country to some extent, um, and you're not really fighting against a revolution, especially when you're you're not the home team. Um, there's really not much you can fight for there. But then when you get to the officers are make tons of mistakes about this. Um, Logistically, they had some problems because they would have to send for supplies. They really weren't good at foraging, not as good certainly as the colonists. And eventually, as the war went on, like we see in many wars, this nature like the Vietnam War, the war was basically unpopular. So that's going into the war. You can see where the advantages and disadvantages. And here I kind of put together a comparative analysis to give you an idea. Troop strength uh, between 50 and 70,000 at any point, with about 30,000 Hessians. The Continental Army all across the continent were basically militias, anywhere between 15,000 and 80,000. George Washington, in the first couple of years of the first few campaigns of the war, when he was escaping from New York, he went from, I think he had about 12,000 men to when he escaped New York, I think he had about 5,000 left. And at his lowest point, he had about 3,000 men um, before he crossed the Delaware and pulled off something miraculous from a morale standpoint. So, um, yeah, they at no point did they have superiority from the troops. Naval power, not even a question. Logistics. One could make the argument the colonial army was probably, I mean, foraging and living off the land is one thing, but you know, I would say, certainly for the type of army that they were, yes, they were very much. The training, the British Army was much better trained. However, the colonial army did a lot on the fly, and things really did turn around after George Washington brings in a Prussian general to come in after I believe it's the winter of 1778, and they come out in fighting season 1779 like a whole new fighting force. So they do get better. Once again, the leadership much better. We get a check in the colonial side, conventional European warfare versus guerrilla tactics, and yada yada. So that's as deep of an analysis as I can give you of the two armies and what they were up. Okay, so let's get into the war itself. Okay, so I picked out the following battles for us to look at. In the early years, what we'll call the Northern Campaign, basically from 1775 up to 1778. Primarily, most of the engagements are occurring basically between Philadelphia and Boston, as the map depicts, with obviously skirmishes elsewhere. But for the most part, the Northern Campaign, the first half of the American Revolutionary War, is fought in these areas. And I've picked the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill, June of 1775, and the Siege of Boston, which is 1775 to 1776. Now, I chose these three to start off because these are the three um, engagements that occur during the Second Continental Congress. So, in what I covered last week, while that is going on in Philadelphia, this is what's going on in the battlefield. The war begins, often referred to as the shot heard round the world. British troops, under orders to seize colonial arms, clashed with militiamen in Massachusetts. Though the British managed to destroy some supplies, the colonists inflicted significant casualties in harassing attacks along the British retreat to Boston. The engagement marked the start of open conflict between Britain and its colonies, igniting the Civil War. So this is a shot heard around the world, and this is the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Now, the Battle of Bunker Hill is interesting, and this is one of those historical controversies. Um, it was fought on the Charlestown Peninsula near Boston, and technically it is a British victory, but it came at a great cost. The troops were under a kind of lackluster general by the name of General Howe. Now, he takes the high ground um, and secures the position on Bunker Hill, the the strategic position. However, he loses over 1,000 men in taking the hill, which is I think he came into it with 2,500. So he loses a significant portion of his force. Wins the ground, but loses almost half of his men. So the colonial militia, although they retreated, they demonstrated that they could stand toe to toe with British regulars. Um, this is it's a step up from the battles of Lexington and Concord, which were kind of a well, one could say it was a little bit of a surprise to the British regulars who were attacked at Lexington and Concord. The Battle of Bunker Hill, the British regulars were ready for this, and the colonial militia stood pretty tall. Um, the Battle of Bunker Hill boosted American morale. It also became, there. What I've also included here are famous paintings or renderings from each one of these battles. And this one here, the Battle of Bunker Hill, I believe this is the fall of General Warren. It depicts one of the generals who gets killed on the colonial side. Is General Warren. I think he's killed on the British side. Excuse me. Um, anyway, so that's a painting there. Get down here, we'll see that famous painting as well. But the battles of Lexington and Concord start the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Bunker Hill is, one can make the argument, it's the counterattack from General Howe's troops who are in control of Boston. So after the Battle of Bunker Hill, he's got this position, but he's got to retreat to secure Boston. And by retreating back into Boston, this is the beginning of the siege of Boston. Following the Battle of Bunker Hill, George Washington takes command of the Continental Army and lays siege to the British forces in Boston. So this is where George Washington begins his. This is where George Washington begins his command. Um, And it's the siege lasts months, as sieges tend to do. Um, but in March of 1776, Patriots positioned new artillery on Dorchester Heights, which would now threaten British ships in the harbor. Once this artillery was positioned, the British realized that they've um, lost the strategic advantage, and they evacuate Boston. Now, the interesting thing about those cannon that were brought to Boston, those were the ones that were seized from Fort Ticonderoga, which was another one of the early victories for the colonists. I talked about this last week. This is one where Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold the basically walked into the fort and captured. I guess it was a small force of British were overseeing Fort Ticonderoga, but they were drunk, and so Ethan Allen they just walked in, basically took the fort. The cannons used for the siege of Boston came from Fort Ticonderoga. The next battle um, is at the end of 1776, and this I think, we're going to say the Battle of Saratoga is certainly the turning point of the American Revolution, but the Battle of Trenton really does save the Continental Army. Um, After a series of defeats, Washington makes his daring attack on Hessian mercenaries who were stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. From a morale standpoint, I think you can definitely say this was a turning point. He decided that on Christmas night, he would cross the icy Delaware River and surprise the enemy, capturing over 900 troops. This victory at Trenton, and then the follow up a couple nights later in Princeton, restored hope and boosted enlistment, demonstrating the importance of tactical surprises in the American strategy. So, George Washington did a little hit and run, and he did it at an opportune time where he could capitalize on it from a recruitment and morale standpoint. So, um, pretty important, Battle of Trenton. Now, in order to understand how the Battle of Saratoga happens, you kind of got to first understand the mistakes that the British make to allow Saratoga to happen. So I don't know if you can see my arrow. I don't know if it's showing up on the map. If not, if you look at where New York is, okay, and if you look up at where Fort Ticonderoga is, actually right here, um, and you look up into where Canada is, the grand strategy, as I said before, from the British was that a General John Burgoyne would have his army here in Canada, which would come down south and meet up um, with who was in charge. It was not. It was General Gage. At this, no, yeah, Gage was in Boston. I'm forgetting my generals. I apologize, but the strategic goal was that the Canadian Army and the New York Army would meet in upstate New York and trap the Continental Army, forcing the Continental Army to leave outside of Philadelphia and outside of Valley Forge, where it had usually put up its winter encampment, get the army out into the open, and crush Washington's army up here in New York. Um, the only problem is that the British are going to change up the strategy on the fly, and I do think this is how actually it does this. Instead of staying put in New York, they're going to make a daring run in 1777 to go down and sail down through the Chesapeake and try to make a move up through Maryland and come up to Philadelphia from the south. Um, whereas this was definitely a surprise move from the British standpoint, it completely left the southern part of this New York strategy open and exposed. And these are the precursors that lead to the Battle of Saratoga. It's the turning point of the war. The American forces, which were led by General Horatio Gates, are going to face General John Burgoyne's army in upstate New York. Now, Burgoyne thought he was going to have support, but unfortunately, he did not. This victory convinced France to formally ally and give its military and financial support. The reason we say that the Battle of Saratoga is the turning point is because it's after this major battle and the defeat of John Burgoyne and a significant part of the British Army. Um, France is taking the colonial effort seriously and decided that they will indeed support the war effort. Now, I've got here the winter at Valley Forge from 1777 to 1778. I made a slip earlier when I said that uh, the new training of the troops came in 1779. I apologize. It's this winter, 1777. It's the winter after Saratoga. Um, the Continental Army had endured pretty harsh conditions during the winter at Valley Forge. All these winters were pretty rough at Valley Forge. 1777, 1778 was the worst. Um, Disease, hunger, lack of supplies continued to dwindle Washington's army. However, it is during this winter that Baron von Steuben is hired. He's a Russian military officer. And the reason why he's in the colonies is actually kind of interesting. He was kicked out of the Prussian army because he's homosexual. And he was disgraced from the Prussian army and found his way as an advisor at training the um, training the Continental Army in the winter of 1777 to 1778. So, Baron von Steuben. Um, some historians believe that that is early LGBTQ history. So there you go. Anyway, so they received critical training in European military tactics, emerging as a much more disciplined and effective fighting force by the spring. Valley Forge, this not a battle, but an encampment, symbolized the resilience and determination of the patriot cause. Okay, so I kind of picked these out as to show kind of the beginning of the Northern Campaign, which it's unorganized. There's a lot of effort. There's a lot of zeal. They pull out a couple of wins early. They take Boston. Um, Meanwhile, you know, after Boston, losses in New York um, certainly took its toll on the army itself. Harsh winters, disease, lack of really strong supplies. By the time we get to the winter of 1776, George Washington once again has got to he's got to do something. He's got to inspire his men somehow, and that's what the Battle of Trenton is. Um, then strategic mishap on the British side exposes a flaw in the British strategy in upstate New York. Horatio Gates takes advantage of that victory in the Battle of Saratoga. Going into the winter at Valley Forge, Scrappy work is found a way to scratch out a few victories. Um, Now they're better trained going into 1778. That is the Northern Campaign. Now, if we switch gears to the South, after Saratoga, it became glaringly obvious that the northern campaign wasn't working for the British, and they started looking at more of a southern campaign, trying to take advantage of the loyalist sentiment in the South, or what they thought was the loyalist sentiment in the South. The key to the Southern strategy would be the capturing of Charleston. In 1780, the British, after shifting their focus to the South, will capture Charleston in one of the worst defeats for the Continental Army. The British forces took control of the city, captured nearly 5,000 American troops, demonstrating their success in the Southern theater. The fall of Charleston really was a catastrophic loss. It was one of the more important ports, and it really does open up the South for any kind of advancement from the standpoint. Now, the follow up in October of 1780, the Battle of Kings Mountain was a decisive victory for the Patriot militia. They defeated a force of loyalists in the backcountry of South Carolina. Remember, one of the strategies coming down into the South was that the British could come down here with regular army, but they could intersperse um, with loyalist militias who would be fighting on the British side. So there are some historians that look at the Revolutionary War in North Carolina and South Carolina almost as more of a civil war than it is a civil war between colonists than it really is a revolution. Much of the fighting was between fellow colonists or loyalists versus patriots. Okay. The victory at Kings Mountain weakened the British influence in the South and boosted American morale. Now, remember, the support in the South wasn't as strong as the British thought they were going to get in the first place. Last week, I mentioned that was because a British royal governor from Virginia by the name of Dunmore suggested that, or recommended as early back as 1777, that enslaved should run away and join the British Army, and they will become free. So their support in the South was starting to be etched away anyway. And now, after the Battle of Kings Mountain, um, some of that momentum is turning in the Patriots' favor. In January of 1781, at the Battle of Cowpens, General Daniel Morgan, another one of unsung heroes in the American Revolution, achieved a key victory and using clever tactics to trap British forces. Morgan's forces feigned a retreat, drawing the British into an ambush. And it's funny. Actually, the movie The Patriot, unfortunately, is really bad from a historical accuracy standpoint. But the way they film the Battle of Cowpens um, is actually pretty accurate, as I understand it. It was a classic feign of a retreat. Get your get the get the opposing force to think it's a rout. Get them to assault you, and then they run into a second stronger force that is hidden behind brush or on different ground or something like that. So anyway, the Battle of Cowpens was won by this maneuver by Morgan. So you're hearing Washington obviously as a general that we're all familiar with, but General Horatio Gates, Daniel Morgan making names for themselves in these battles. And then lastly, the Siege of Yorktown. So when the Southern strategy started to fail, General Cornwallis, who was in charge of the force in the South, decided that he was going to audible and he was going to march to north um, into Virginia and take advantage of naval superiority around Virginia and get resupplied in Virginia. And then I think the plan was then to make another move up north and connect with the British Army for an assault on Philadelphia. Um, Unfortunately, by the time the 1781 rolls around, it's a new ball game because the French army and the French navy are now involved. And with the help of Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, and the French navy, which was able to check that superiority in the Chesapeake Bay, by the time Cornwallis makes his way to Yorktown, he's basically set up in a trap. Uh, okay, so victory at last. The surrender at Yorktown marks the end of major fighting in the war in 1781. Although and this is kind of the way things were back then, although the fighting stopped in 1781, the official treaty wasn't signed until 1783. Um, and what comes out of the Treaty of Paris? Um, the Treaty of Paris basically gives us the map that we see here on this slide. Um, Everything that you see in this kind of light green area here, um, from the original 13 colonies all the way out to the Mississippi River, that is now the United States. If you're asking what's going on down here in the South, um, those lines down there represent disputed Native American territory. If I remember correctly, I believe that's the Choctaws, Choctaw, Cherokee, maybe. Cherokee were more little, no, maybe Cherokee, Choctaw. Yeah. And then Florida is Spanish Empire. As rest of as you can see, everything to the west of the Mississippi River, all the way down into Mexico and into South America, is the Spanish Empire. You'll see at this point, the French Empire is only in Haiti. Although the French will make a deal with the Spanish and they will get their Louisiana territory back. We'll look at that later. So what the Treaty of Paris essentially does is it does establish. Oh, turn up sound. Sorry. Is that my sound, Paulette? My voice? Oh, I think I was actually leaning away from my microphone. Okay, so Treaty of Paris basically establishes the United States borders, fishing rights. There were a few things that were negotiated in the 1783 treaty that I'll kind of cover in the second half of class when we talk about the revolution within, namely the treatment of loyalists after the war. The British were a little concerned at how the United States of America was going to treat those who um, supported the British during the war, the Loyalists. All right, so the Revolutionary War in perspective. The war was a conflict shaped by pivotal battles, um, strategic alliances, and the resilience. I think we can say the resilience of the Continental. The early battles like Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill demonstrated the colonists' resolve, while the later engagements like Saratoga, Yorktown, um, really secured those crucial alliances that ensured victory. Um, Despite some setbacks, the guerrilla tactics, perseverance, and ultimately French support allowed the Americans to outlast the British. I think that's really the best way to describe this, is that they outlasted the British, who had just lost all popular support back home for this war. It establishes the United States once again as an independent nation and sets the stage up for a new era in American history. Now, I want to use this opportunity. 6:52. You know what? I think what I'm going to do, wanted to, I'm just looking through my notes real quick. I wanted to talk really quickly about historiography, a little bit about historiography before we take a little bit of. When I talk about historiography, once again, I'm talking about how perspectives on certain topics change over time and how there's new scholarship, a new way of thinking. Um, okay. So, from a historiography standpoint, most of your historians, um, I think what you see has happened in the last 20 to 30 years is an attempt at a more balanced approach and kind of looking at it from a British imperial standpoint. Um, and, you know, I think an a United States perspective on the the British Empire during the Revolution. Obviously, I mean, we can see how we depict the British Empire in Schoolhouse Rock and how they were the big bad guys, and certainly, there's a lot of that propaganda that justified the actions of the original revolutionaries, that kind of glorified the patriot cause. I think what you're seeing today, and certainly in the last 20 to 30 years, is an attempt to kind of balance out that perspective and look at more of you know the the, the British had some legitimate fiscal reasons for imposing the taxes that they did on the colonial on the colonies. So um, I had a whole bunch of other notes written up on different historiography, but I think I'm gonna pass on that, and we'll just go into our break and come back. We'll do the revolution within. When we look at what I want to set you up for what the revolution within is going to be about is generally from a philosophical standpoint. Many people look at the American Revolution as a triumph of the common man, right? Except when we look at it, we have to look at what the limits of those freedoms that were won and who was limited in their liberty. We obviously know that white propertied males are going to be the biggest beneficiary of what happens after the revolution. I think part of what we're going to look at in the second half of this class is how the revolution looked and meant to others in our society. And we're going to look at that through the lens of Native Americans. We're going to look at what that looks like through African Americans. And we're going to look at what that meant for women. There were many women who supported the revolution because the revolution had a place for women in it. The role of the revolutionary woman, the daughter of the American Revolution, right? Homespun liberty, all these movements that grew out of the revolution that were that helped women play a role in the revolution. So there was generally this idea, certainly among some of the lower classes, that this would open up more opportunities in this new nation that is talking about liberty, it's talking about freedom. And I think what we will find is that those liberties were not there for women, um, at least not in the beginning. And then, therefore, women represent the women's rights movement, which many historians say begins in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. We'll get to that later. And this ties into historiography too. Is many historians actually say the beginning of the women's rights movement begins right here during the Revolution, when many women, like Abigail Adams, is a good example of this, who felt that there would be this Republican motherhood in this new country, this new nation, based on these new ideals. And there would be a place for women in this nation. And when it wasn't there, that's when you start to see the beginning of the women's rights movement towards suffrage, towards equal rights, things that were left out of the new nation. And what we will see is as we set up the second half of this class, we'll set up the second half of this, the rest of this course, is we do build based on our principles and experiences with the British Empire, we do build a government and a land that is freer than the one that we broke off from. But that freedom is very limited in in our founding. And I say I've said this to all um, my students, anybody that ever gets me talking about U.S. history, I'll say, yes, there's a lot of flawed things about our government, about our documents. But what the founding fathers did do right is they created a system of government that could adapt and could change, truly putting the government into the hands of the people. And I do believe that. And the rest of this class, when we look at the social aspect of history, we're going to look at the top down stuff. We're going to look at the wars. We're going to look at politics. We're going to look at presidential history. We're going to look at all that stuff. But I'm also going to squeeze in there Native American history, or African American history, or women's history, those that were left out of the original plan, but are sneaking in through the back door that the founding fathers left open. And that's a struggle in American. That's a story in American history that's also important to tell. We'll be telling both of those stories at the same time. So what I'm going to do after the break is I'm going to set you up for all those stories and show you where the gaps were um, in when we originally conceived of this notion of liberty and equality for all in a new nation. So, okay, Marianne. Well, let's go ahead and take a break. I only need about 5 minutes. I definitely need to wet my whistle a little bit. Okay. 7:05. I'm going to go ahead and pick back up. All right. I'm breaking down um, the revolution within, which is basically the social and political changes that occur in the 13 colonies, which will become the United States, um, as a result of the revolution. Okay. So, first of all, let's talk about the expanding concepts of freedom and equality. What does it mean to be free and equal? Because those words were thrown around a whole lot during the revolution. Those words were put into documents declaring what we as a nation were going to be: freedom and equality. So, what does that mean, right? While the revolution was a struggle for independence, um, it was also a revolution for a profound transformation of political thought. It introduces the idea of democratizing freedom, challenging any ideas of hierarchies, of monarchies, or aristocracies. And instead, it encourages, and remember, all of this is tied into Lockean notions of, of natural rights that had been the founding fathers' main education was Lockean theories. This is the revolution that unlocks these theories and principles. Okay? Um, what they're doing is they're encouraging greater participation by ordinary citizens in government. This is groundbreaking for the 1700s. Um, the revolution's impact was seen in the development of new state constitutions that embraced every constitution. So before we had a general constitution for the United States, which that hasn't really, we're not really a United States quite yet, at least not in theory. We're still a loose confederation, if you will, of different states. So each state is writing after the revolution their new updated constitution. And each one of these constitutions has notions of republicanism and popular sovereignty in them. What does that mean? Republicanism being an idea of a representation by a virtuous elite of a populace. Okay, so republicanism, as it was laid out as a British political theory in the late 1600s, and then developed in practice by the American colonies of the 18th century, 1700s. Republicanism is the idea that an elected body of people who are voted on by a group of land owning males, and this body represents the people. But under a Republican form of thought, the people who decide who will represent them, these people are what would be called a virtuous elite. They are people of power and prestige who know what's better for the rest of us. Now, the idea of popular sovereignty is actually something a little bit more radical. Popular sovereignty is the idea that, well, you have a certain amount of people living in a community, and those people who are eligible to vote or have a vote in the political process issue their vote, and whoever has more votes wins the issue, wins the seat, whatever. Um, each state constitution is going to have varying degrees of how much control they want to have over who has political power. But everyone is doing some form of voting and representation in all of these constitutions. No one's telling them to do Republican style or Republican forms of government. There's no overarching, there's no crown or parliament directing them. These are all developing on their own. Okay. And what essentially this does is it shifts power to the representatives who directly are elected by the people. Though the ideals of political equality did not initially include women, enslaved individuals, or Native Americans. The revolution, however, would plant the seeds for future social movements that would be more inclusive. But ultimately, right after the revolution, it's a very limited bunch. Even that is more than much than what political power, where political power had been situated before, certainly in the in aristocracies of Europe, is the political power was in the wealthy and elite and the landed and those who were tied in. At least in this new environment, if you are a small landowner, as long as you have land in many colonies, you do have a right to vote or be part of the political process. A central revolutionary concept was equality, though it focused more on equal opportunity than it really did on any social or economic equality. As we all know, there was really this country. It's interesting because it's a country that's founded on free market capitalism, but it espouses all of the principles of social and economic equality, which we know free market capitalism is far from promoting economic equality. Um, Now, class distinctions will persist after with the revolution, but the revolution will rethink this idea of birthright and privilege. that no longer should you have access to political power just simply because of your birthright. Um, so those were some like, and in the press in the in the grand scheme of things in the 1700s, this is revolutionary. The idea that just because you were born wealthy doesn't mean that you have political power, excuse me, that someone who was not high born, or someone who wasn't born with some kind of title might actually have political power over you. I mean, that is some groundbreaking stuff. All right. One of the most significant outcomes of the revolution was the expansion of political participation. Many states reduced property qualifications for voting and holding office. So instead of having to own, like in South Carolina, at one point you had to own 250 acres in order to run for public office. Those qualifications were less. They weren't removed. You still had to have some form of some land, but it does open up opportunity for many more people who otherwise would not have been available to gain or participate in politics. Now, places like Pennsylvania, our great state, radical shifts in governance led to the removal of property qualifications and the adoption of annual elections, reflecting the revolutionary spirit of inclusion. These changes spurred the creation of state constitutions that enshrine the principles of popular sovereignty, setting precedents for citizens involved in more citizens in government. So I guess what I'm trying to hammer home is every state, as they're drawing up their constitutions, had everyone had some form of a Republican government, representative government. Where the differences were what the property qualifications were in order to for you to have what would be called male suffrage. Um, so when we look at this democratization of freedom, it's giving in a general idea, it is giving more people the right to vote, but it is not really truly espousing social and political equality. It's more social and political opportunity, is really the way that it is in practice, as opposed to what it is in writing. That makes sense. Oh, so we'll pick up here. Out of this, out of these differing practices in representative government, and we're talking about who gets the right to vote, or what should be, let's say, what should be the qualifications to give someone the right to vote in the 1780s in this new American country. And there's two trains of thought. And I've got a clip on this slide that I love playing. It's from the John Adams miniseries, but it is basically Thomas Jefferson and John Adams discussing their ideas on politics to some extent. This scene is in France at a time when Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin. I don't know if they all three of them were really there in France at the same time. This was just something that was put together for the show. But I like the way that this scene comes out because it really does show you two sides of, or two different trains of thought when it comes to politics, when it comes to who should get the right to vote. These two different trains of thought will become the basis for our American political parties. I'll make that connection in a second. But look at it this way. If you look at a more conservative form, and I guess at the risk of tying in 1780s politics to today's politics, you certainly can. If you look at a more conservative side of of thinking in the 1780s is yes, we absolutely want to have a big political electorate. However, we want to make sure that we are only having those who are deemed worthy, if you will, to have the right to vote. We don't want to give everyone the right to vote. We only want to give landed men up to a certain amount, who own a certain amount of property or whatever the qualifications are. We want to protect the political process from the lower classes. Really, what they want to do is they want to make sure that political power rests in the middle class and up. Okay, that is by definition representation and political power by a virtuous elite. Okay, that is a certain way of thinking. Now, if you go more to the left in the 1780s, you want to call them liberals, that's fine. We're going to call them Lockeans. We're going to talk about the men like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, okay, who believed that the political power should be in all men, universal male suffrage to some extent. And once again, it's hard to determine whether Thomas Jefferson really believed in universal male suffrage. He said a lot of things that he were kind of hypocritical, but certainly Thomas Jefferson, from a political standpoint, is going to be over on this more liberal side. We should give as many people the right to vote, as many men the right to vote as possible, and they have a larger engaging political body versus a more Republican form of government, which is a smaller, more elite electorate to choose um, what they think are the best people for to lead. In order to see that embodied in two different individuals, let's look at this video with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Listen very carefully to the words that they say, and what you will hear is the beginning of American political parties in this country, with the Federalist Party emerging out of the Constitution, out of the arguments over the Constitution, the Federalists kind of adopting this more Republican standpoint, and the Democratic Republicans over here on this more universal standpoint. And then these two parties will become even more branded by the people who were front and center in espousing their ideals. On this side, the Jeffersonians, Thomas Jefferson's influence. On this side, the Hamiltonian, with Alexander Hamilton's side. And that becomes our political landscape for the first 20 years of this country's history. But before we get to that, this is the conversation that many representatives are having as state constitutions are being developed in the 1780s. I personally do not think that there's an easier way to describe the difference between the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, which is not formed in the 1780s. This would be formed really during the Washington administration, which we will get into next week. But early on, I mean, it is fascinating. I love reading about as much about Jefferson as I can. Jefferson's viewpoints on revolution, whereas he certainly believed in them theoretically, practically, he's we'll look plenty at Jefferson when we get to his presidency. But in what he said to John Adams, and I don't know if he really said this, but I do love this scene, is him saying, Mr. A, John Adams, Mr. Adams, you have a disconcerting lack of faith in your fellow man. Okay. That's kind of that kind of sums up what the idea behind representation of political power is determined only by those who are from a virtuous lead, right? You have that that goes in line with someone whose political theories. I don't really have a whole lot of faith in my fellow man to make the right decisions on who to lead us. Versus the criticism of Thomas Jefferson from John Adams is, on the other hand, you have a dangerous excess of faith in your fellow man. Otherwise, saying to Thomas Jefferson, well, you really do trust that if we make the electorate larger, that more people are going to make good choices. Now, whereas this is kind of set up early on, and I'm setting this up early on as to what the debates coming out of the revolution are, how much freedom is free. There are limits here, and every state's kind of determining what that is at this point. When we get a federal government, and we get a constitution in place, then these discrepancies between the states and the federal government are going to obviously become a problem, um, that can only really be solved by a civil war. But early on, you can see each state, depending on who its leaders are coming out of the revolution, are just kind of putting its mark on where they are in the democracy scale, I guess you could say. But all of them are talking about balanced governments, checks and balances, republic style governments. That is one thing I do push back on people. Oh, we live in a democracy. I mean, no, it was never really founded to. I mean, we have democratic values, but I mean, there was really nothing in our founding documents that really say we're a democracy. I mean, we're a democratic republic. I mean, that's really the form of government that we are. We have levels, and we'll look next week when we do the Constitution. We'll really look at what that means and why that's the form of government based on what our founding documents are. But it's not. We don't live in a true democracy. Never have. There are some aspects of our political system that are based on true democracy. But then again, I mean, even from our founding, not everyone has had the right to vote, or has been eligible to vote, so not a true democracy. So I've beaten that whole thing into the ground. So that's the political side of what the revolution unleashed. It unleashed a debate in this country that one can make the argument is still going on today. Who should have the right to vote? Who should have political power in this
convention?
Let's shift gears. And we're going to talk about religion. Okay. All right. The American Revolution not only altered political structures, but it also transformed the relationship between religion and government. Independence reshapes ideas about personal freedoms. The revolution set the stage for new debates about religious liberty, pluralism, and the role of Christianity in public life. Religious diversity expanded, and the boundaries of tolerance were tested as Americans began to wrestle with how faith should fit into these newly emerging, these newly developed Republican ideas. Before the revolution, religious toleration was pretty limited. Remember, there's still hundreds of years of religious strife, certainly among the different Christian denominations. We talked about the role that Protestantism played in Britain, and in the 1600s and 1700s, how there was a certain amount of pluralism as we had, some Protestant faiths, Anglicans in Virginia, we had Quakers in Pennsylvania, you've got your Puritans in Massachusetts. Um, you know that those early communities definitely had religious identities. But what you find in the 1700s as more and more groups of people are coming into the colonies, and especially if they're coming in and they're practicing faiths that may not be um, well received in, say, a Catholic colony like Maryland or an Anglican colony like Virginia. They instead these newcomers, if you will, go further out west and develop into the hinterland and kind of develop some of their own experiences. Certainly, we saw with the Scotch Germans coming into places like Pennsylvania, and we see Presbyterianism, we see Methodism coming in at various points, and we saw that was part of that great awakening that we talked about. So a lot of the the toleration that we saw going on was mainly just um, it was really the growth of these evangelical movements and kind of forcing themselves from a as the population is growing, they're just attracting more and more followers in these evangelical movements. So it's hard to say that there wasn't a lot of toleration. It was kind of just you moved somewhere where people were gonna where you could find other followers of a similar faith. And so the colonies had pluralism, but not inclusion, I guess you could say. So, um, but one of the things that's going to kind of shift us towards more of an inclusive attitude overall, certainly as we move towards religious toleration as a founding principle, is our relationship with France. For the most part, except for a few colonies here and there and a few pockets here and there, the Catholics weren't very well welcome here in the colonies. But the French were mostly Catholic, so after the Revolution, they're our friends. So we're going to ease our collective um, animosity, I guess you could say, towards Catholics. Um, um, Yeah. So once again, and one thing that is also, we will look at this. We won't really look at this in this class, but if we do decide to do a History 112, where I do like the next half of this class, and we look at the role of World War One and World War Two, it's very interesting how wars have their own revolutionary effect on societies after. Certainly when we look at the beginning of the civil rights era, that happens right after World War II. And a lot of that is because of returning veterans, African American veterans coming home from the war, are very organized to become some of the early foot soldiers, if you will, of the early civil rights movement in the 1950s. Well, to some extent, some of that's going on after the revolution. Men who fought alongside French Catholics during the war, they're not Catholics aren't that bad. So some of that is going on from an attitude standpoint. Now, the founders recognized that religious diversity was becoming a feature. It's not one of those things where it's they looked around, saw what was developing, and leaned into it, kind of a thing, right? They sought to manage this diversity by promoting the principle of religious liberty while preventing any single faith from dominating public life. So once again, you can kind of see the way the founding fathers dealt with this religious plurality is almost politically. They wanted to do it in a way. So this religious toleration that we have is born out of the idea we don't want any religion looking like it's dominant over the others, or any denomination of Christianity. Um, and deism. I talked about deism as a part of the intellectual movements of the 1700s. Um, Deism was this idea, and it was this justification that allowed them to philosophically separate church and state. It's the idea, deism is this idea that there is still a God, there is still a being, and but he's not the great puppeteer that maybe he's been depicted as, he or she, whatever. Um, not the great puppeteer, that basically the earth and human beings created in his image, they were put on this planet, and the laws of science were set up, and then God backs out, lets everything kind of work. That was very, reductively, that was deism. Um, and it gave the founding fathers an environment where they could have their faith and their science at the same time. So, to some extent, that deism is one of the reasons why we have this idea, this concept of separation of church and state. Which, once again, keep in mind, is more about making sure that there's not any one dominant faith, dominant religion, centralized power. Okay? It's the centralized power part that the founding fathers really keen on preventing. Okay? Now, the most famous example of the founders' commitment to religious liberty is Thomas Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia. The bill became law in 1786 and de-established the Anglican Church as the official state church of the colony, of the state, and declared that no person could be compelled to support a religious institution or suffer on account of their beliefs. Jefferson's vision emphasized that freedom of conscience was a natural right and that true religious liberty required the absence of government interference in religious matters. That was outlawed in Virginia's bill and became the basis for um, the um, the Bill of Rights. Okay. Now, what did the revolution do to actual churches? It profoundly affected Christian denominations. Um, as I said, the disestablishment of churches, this idea that there would no longer be a colony, now state, established church. As I said, Virginia disestablishing from Anglicanism. What it did was it reduced the power of the clergy and gave rise to new denominations. The decline of state supported churches allowed for the flourishing of America's Christian diversity. And this will lead to a second Great Awakening. By the time we get to the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, there's even a greater explosion of a religious diversity and evangelicalism as a result of this. Okay? All right, and though the revolution did expand religious freedom, there were still limits on this liberty. Christian, really, we're talking about Christian liberty. Okay, non-Christian faiths such as Judaism, any indigenous spiritual practices, were still viewed with suspicion and were not considered to be, legitimate, or at least wasn't something that could be actively practiced without, I guess, scorn. um, yeah. So let's make sure we do know we're talking about Christian liberty. Okay. With that, I do want to talk once again Pennsylvania, my new adopted home. Uh, Pennsylvania's constitution actually becomes the model for the relationship between religion and Republican government. It incorporated Christian republicanism, an idea that combined religious faith with Republican virtues, suggesting that morality and civic responsibility were essential to the success of the new nation. Um, and Pennsylvania had always embraced religious plurality. Obviously, Quakers were certainly very tolerant of all religions and faiths, even the indigenous spiritual faiths. Um, yeah. Okay. So, in conclusion, on the religious aspect, the American Revolution redefined the role of religion in public life. It fostered toleration, pluralism, and individual liberty. Yet, the legacy of the revolution was not without its contradictions. Um, while religious liberty was greatly expanded, there were still limits to any of those non Christian faiths. Okay, economic freedom. Revolution, as we looked at, it's redefined political liberty, it's redefined religious liberty, and now how's it going to deal with economic freedom? Okay. Central to the revolutionary vision was this idea of free labor and the rejection of any economic practices associated with inherited money or monopoly at all. Okay. The revolutionary founding fathers wanted to establish a republic that aligned personal independence with economic self determination. Once again, they wanted to create a place that that provided limitless economic opportunity. Okay? They weren't looking for economic equality, they were looking for economic opportunity. These men all read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and they all bought into the idea, and they lived through this idea. The idea that um, wealth can be generated individually without the invisible hand of government putting its hand into your economic policies. Free market capitalism, as described by Adam Smith, if you have a product, you should be able to sell that product on the free market to whoever you want to at whatever price you deem worthy that the market will allow it to bear. Um, for an emerging new nation that absolutely hated the idea of extra taxation and mercantilism, this is perfect. Certainly for the merchant class of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, even the southern um, colonies or the southern states. For them, economic freedom meant no government intervention. Now, along with that is the idea of free labor. Free labor is this idea that individuals should be able to control their own labor and benefit from its fruits, like an asset, emerged as a key component in the new republic's identity. In this vision, economic freedom was connected to political freedom. A true independent citizen was one who could sustain themselves without relying on the patronage or control of someone else. This concept became the soul of the republic, reinforcing the idea that freedom required self reliance and the ability to participate in the economy on fair terms. And that's where the equality is. The equality is that everyone has the same opportunity, or in theory. Economic equality was promoted by eliminating systems of inheritance. And this was the thing the founding father, Thomas Jefferson went after this big time. And it's actually interesting because if you look at the founding fathers or some of even if you go far back into the lineage of some of your founding fathers, the reason many of them were here was because at some point down the road, they were second sons, or they weren't the ones who were supposed to inherit the family estate. Um, Many revolutionary leaders saw the primogeniture practice of passing estates to the eldest son and entail, primogeniture and entail. It's on the slide. Entail was laws were laws that prevented land from being sold outside of the family. So basically, what Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers looked at, and they looked at how wealth in Europe had always been concentrated amongst these powerful families. and that there was never any opportunity for anyone else to get into that level of wealth. Their thinking was by eliminating entail and primogeniture, you're basically eliminating this system of hereditary. It's a way to break down the walls of hereditary rule at its economic root. And they thought it would basically wash away aristocratic privilege. By abolishing these practices, the new republic wanted to democratize access to wealth. That's the theory. Okay? Ensuring that property could be more evenly distributed and transferred according to individual choice rather than family tradition. Now, the debate over free trade. Okay. Um, the economic upheaval of the Revolutionary War introduced new challenges, in particular in managing, here you go, here's the topic that never goes away, inflation and price stability. Continental Congress printed paper currency to finance the war, and inflation soared, leading to widespread hardship. Widespread hardship. Many working people and farmers responded with just price protests, demanding that merchants sell goods at reasonable, stable prices. These protests reflected the belief that economic freedom did not mean unchecked profit seeking, but should align with the common good. Merchants, however, argued that inflation and scarcity justified higher prices, igniting a debate about the balance between public welfare and market freedom. So as early as the 1780s, these conversations, these economic debates over market freedom versus how the government or whatever government body should intervene. This argument, this debate is as old as the nation. All right. The next few slides are about the limits of liberty. Not everyone secured the liberties. Not everyone secured liberties coming out of it. During the Revolution, about 20 to 25% of the colonists remained steadfast, loyal to the crown. These loyalists represented a cross section of colonial society. Mostly they were merchants with strong trade ties, they were conservative elites. Many of them were enslaved people that were promised freedom by the British as a part of that Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Regions like New York, Pennsylvania, and the backcountry of North and South Carolina and Georgia had significant loyalist populations. Um, and as we saw, during the war in the Carolinas, those loyalist patriot splits actually became kind of quasi civil wars. So, um, after the war, many of these loyalists either fled to Canada or Britain to escape persecution. Some were exiled from their communities. A lot of them, their property was confiscated by patriots. It's kind of actually interesting that the British, as a part of their negotiation of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, actually negotiated to uh, to try and retain or regain some of the loyalists' property that had been seized. Um, so, although the loyalists certainly weren't treated great at the end of the revolution, there was actually somebody in their corner to somewhat try and get some validation for them. That is not the case when we look at Native Americans. I was saying earlier how from a historiographical standpoint, there are different perspectives and different ways to look at the American Revolution. In the last 20 years, there's certainly been some work on the Native American, looking at the American Revolution through the Native American eyes. And from a Native American standpoint, it was a borderland conflict. was not a revolution at all. I mean, they had been at war with British colonists as far as they could tell. I mean, remember, you know, British colonists, British settlers have been encroaching on Native American lands in the western part of this Ohio Valley area for well over a century. And so, as far as the Native Americans were concerned, they've been fighting the same people just under different flags. Um, Many of these Native American groups, however, were hoping that during the revolution, if they sided with the British, that if the British won, then maybe there might be some kind of territorial negotiation or some kind of benefits from joining the British. And why wouldn't they join the British side? They certainly looked like they were going to win this thing. However, after the British defeat, the Treaty of Paris recognized American independence and established the US Canadian border. But one thing it did not establish is any of the rights or the status of Native Americans. Kind of left them out of the whole vision. And once again, much like the French and Indian War, Native Americans felt that they didn't have a seat at the table when they should have. The rhetoric of liberty and self-governance did not extend to Native Americans. They saw their land as sovereign, and even kind of bought into the idea of, okay, self-governance, we can get behind that. However, here was the problem with any kind of established Native American nations, is that right after the revolution, one of the best ways to get rich and one of the best ways to make a living was as a land speculator or a surveyor. So this army of speculators and surveyors start coming out to the Ohio River Valley, starting to gobble up land in the hopes that they can sell these lands back to eventual federal governments, state governments, as we're going to see when next week when we look at the Articles of Confederation. Basically, the early federal government, if you want to call it that, during the 1780s, was just a real estate broker. They didn't really have enough power to really do anything other than negotiate land deals with Native Americans. And that's a lot of what is going on in this period of time. A lot of land speculation, a lot of business. Now, for white men, okay, freedom meant settling and owning land. Land was the commodity. Now, I said weeks ago, Native Americans never really looked at, comprehended, or conceived of land in the form of commodity. Now, the Mohawk leader, Joseph Brant, he's going to be one of the figures during this time period is going to exemplify Native American resistance to this economic expansion of their land. Brant and other Native leaders allied with the British, hoping to protect their lands, but their efforts were in vain after the British defeat. As American settlers started moving into the Ohio Valley and beyond, Native Americans faced increasing pressure to cede their lands and assimilate into this expanded republic. In a in lieu of any kind of self-governance, the policies that actually were adopted were one of guardianship over Native American lands and affairs, treating Native American peoples as wards of individual states if their populations remained inside states, inside existing states. This paternalistic system would further undermine Native autonomy, forcing them into even more unequal treaties and limiting their ability to control their territory. The revolution's promise of freedom for Americans carried a starkly different meaning for Native Americans who saw the growth of white freedom was the loss of freedom and loss of land for them. Once again, getting back to this idea of land as a commodity was just such a sticking point in the difference between these two cultures. And then we're running a little behind. Let me just talk a little bit about let me wrap up with my notes on African Americans. I'll save my content for women to start off next class. All right. Slavery and the Revolution, the language of freedom and contradiction. The revolution definitely creates a major paradox for our young republic. We fought in the name of freedom and equality while slavery remained deeply entrenched, especially in the South. The revolutionary rhetoric emphasized individual liberty, natural rights, and that language is going to work its way into the enslaved population. It gave some within, certainly with those who had access to literature in the North more than in the South, it is going to provide them with powerful language that they then would use to demand their own freedom. Um, Now, politically, the abolitionist movement has nothing going on right now. We're not going to see the true abolitionist movement isn't going to really get started until really after the War of 1812. However, there was a belief after the Revolution that slavery as an institution was going to eventually die out. This is one of the reasons why the founding fathers, as we'll look at next week when we talk about the Constitution, founding fathers were pretty ambiguous when it came to the institution of slavery. The word slave and slavery, you can't find it anywhere in the Constitution, but there are some references that one could make the argument there are references to the enslaved populations for sure. Um, and obviously, next week we'll look at three-fifths compromise and all that stuff. But um, there was a general idea after the revolution, certainly in the North, that slavery just was not a sustainable institution that it would work its way out. There is a graph. There's a graph I don't have. Maybe I'll bring it next week. I think it's on one of my future slides that shows the natural decline in slavery after the revolution up until about 1810, more like maybe 1805. That natural decline is certainly in the North, um, and somewhat in the South, is because there's this natural. It's more market driven than anything, but there's a natural decline in slavery. What brings slavery back up is going to be the introduction of the cotton crop. But for this brief period of time, it really does look like on its own, slavery is going to work its way out. Um, and certainly those numbers do support it. Tell you what, I'm running out of time to really do the rest of this talk any justice. So I'm actually going to stop right there. I will pick up next week with, I'll finish up this little um, information on slavery and the revolution, and they'll go into the role women played in the revolution. That actually will be a good segue right into the Constitution, which we'll do next week, and then probably the beginning of the Federalist period next week, and the beginning of the nation. So, sorry, I got a little verbose there and probably cost us some time, and I apologize. Thank you again.